Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Tabadlab Live. These are conversations that we have with leaders in Pakistan, in the wider region, and around the world to help us maybe try and understand the world a little bit better. Today, I'm especially privileged and honored to welcome Dr. Sania Nishtar to Tabadlab. Of course, I'd love to have a wide-ranging conversation with her, but just to begin with, who is Dr. Nishtar? Many of you will, of course, recognize and know the name. She was the Minister for Poverty Alleviation and the head of the Ehsaas program, as well as the Benazir Income Support Program from 2018 till the early part of 2021. Prior to that, Dr. Nishtar has served on various global boards and work closely with international organizations, including the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, and a whole slew of other organizations, helping them understand not just health and women and the betterment of people here in Pakistan, but in the wider region and around the world. Dr. Nishtar, I'm really, like I said, honored to have you with us today, and really happy we're finally having this conversation. It's been a really interesting and I think difficult couple of years for Pakistani women, for Pakistani children in particular, I think for all Pakistanis in general. I wanted to just start off with your immediate impressions of how bad the macroeconomic and political crisis has been for the people who are your reason for getting up in the morning and going to work every day. For at least now 2.5, 3 decades, you've been working closely on these issues, particularly on issues related to public health, to the better stature of women here and around the world, for improved health and livelihoods for families. All of these agenda items seem to suffer the most when there's a large-scale crisis. And of course, it's not just Pakistan that has been in the eye of a storm politically and economically. It's also globally. There have been multiple crises that have really wrecked our understanding of stability. How worried are you about the state of the things that are important to you right now?
Well, first of all, Mosharraf, thank you for inviting me to this very exciting workplace. It's delightful to see how you've organized your design thinking, which is very evident in your workplace. Thank you for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. In terms of your question, and I think you rightly said that this is a time when the world is suffering from polycrises. It's not just Pakistan. So, we are just emerging from COVID, which caused a major disruption. It virtually shut down the world and its supply chains with far-reaching effects. And on top of that, there are a number of different crises. The aftermath of the crises and what the crises do while they're raging. There are wars and conflicts all over the world. And then, of course, climate change is ravaging, and its effects are evident in many parts of the world, and Pakistan being one of them. The floods of last year are in the recent past. So the world is in the throes of a number of different crises, and on top of that, there are a lot of macroeconomic crises in a number of different countries. Look at where inflation is heading. Even a number of developed countries have debt and deep fiscal crises. So the entire world is in a very unprecedented situation, and clearly Pakistan has not been immune from its impact. And then, of course, Pakistan has its own challenges. So in terms of COVID, we came out much better than the rest of the world, as you know. The response of Pakistan was much better. The mortality and morbidity was much better. But then the global supply chain disruptions and what it did to international oil prices and the prices of commodities has affected us deeply. And then, of course, climate change, and we just talked about the floods and what they did. It submerged a very substantial part of the country. And then the macroeconomic crisis that Pakistan saw, what happened to the currency, where inflation went, what happened to to our debt, to the deepening fiscal crisis, that's in front of us. And of course, as a combination of all these things, poverty escalated by unprecedented numbers. Fast forward to presently to today, the political polarization is in front of us. The fragmentation of the society, the security situation. So these are very precarious times, and whenever there are precarious times, it is the most vulnerable that bear the brunt. And amongst the most vulnerable segments of the society, the ultra vulnerable are the women and children. So in terms of your question, does it keep me awake at night? Does it worry me? Of course it does. I'm sure it would worry any Pakistani who has an iota of concern for the country and its people.
Yeah. When COVID first hit, it was late February when the early watchers were able to tell this isn't going to be good. I think through March, a lot of people needed convincing, but by April, I think everybody was convinced. One way in which some sleepless nights were mitigated was what was then called the Ehsaas Emergency Cash Program. This, to my mind, was the boldest renewal of Pakistan's promise to its people that we had seen ever since the beginning of the Benazir Income Support Program. I think that was the first generation of that story. But really, the EEC was this massive cash injection. Massive in the sense that we'd never had that amount of cash going directly from the Republic into the hands of the people that needed it. If I'm not mistaken, it was originally a quantum of 12,000 rupees in a one-time payment made to 16 million families. Now, I think we might have missed that target of 16 million by a few hundred thousand, but at the time, I thought it was revolutionary. I thought that there was many things that we could have built on top of that. And indeed, I know that when you were in government, you did actually use that as a Trojan horse to do a lot of other important policy sort of innovations in terms of social protection. How do you feel the legacy of that has gone? I mean, it's still relatively recent. It's only 2.5 years ago. But in the sense, have you felt like that was as revolutionary as it could have been? And maybe also talk about the process of getting that approved, because I have so many questions on this, as you know. I can't imagine that it was easy to convince your colleagues in cabinet, for example, at that time, when we didn't know where things were going to go, to get that quantum of money allocated to something like this. Just talk us through that and also the kind of legacy lessons for you.
So my book on Ehsaas is coming out hopefully in a matter of weeks now, and there's a big chapter on Ehsaas Emergency Cash, how it was conceptualized, what its components were, and how it was rolled out, and the lessons. I think it was one of the most profoundest experiences of my professional career. And in terms of how it started, you see, when we went into lockdowns, Pakistan has 32 million workers who are either piece rate workers or they're daily wage workers, or they work in Pakistan's informal economy. And when the lockdowns came into effect, life for them was at a standstill. And I recall people calling me and saying that, Khuda ke liye kuch karo, for God's sake do something, because we fill up our cars with provisions, we try and hand out provisions, but our cars are attacked. There's so many hungry people out there. So there was a cabinet decision to set aside ₹1 trillion for COVID assistance, and we were given initially 179 billion out of that. And I knew I had to do something fast, quick, something revolutionary. And in the summer before that, like you, I like working on whiteboards. My office, as you must have visited, is all whiteboards with a lot of thinking, conceptual thinking. And in the previous summer, I had designed something centered on incoming SMSs, use of data analytics, and the use of biometric payment systems. And the then secretaries working with me said this demand side model is too revolutionary. But in any case, we started building the blocks. So 9 months and we procured a biometric payment system, perfected the data analytics, well, not perfected, but kind of used the data analytics model. And you must have remembered the 8 lakh 20,000 log who exited from the system based on that. And the use of incoming SMSs. So when, at the height of COVID, when there was desperation and, the imperative to do something quickly, and I called everyone and I said, we have the potential to execute like this. And there was a lot of resistance initially internally. I said, well, you have to tell me if there's a better way of doing this. We can't just rely on a survey which is 10 years old. We've got to have a demand side component. So let the carpenter, the tailor, the retailer, the maid who was out of work, let them reach out to us, for heaven's sake. So I got my own shop round to this idea, put it on paper, and I had a style of working where I used to call, the team from Nadra to my office, the team from the bank to my office, people who were actually working with their hands, not just the top bosses. And I got them to vet this, and we had a good IT team, and we figured out that this was executable. And once I was convinced, I took it to the Prime Minister. He seemed to trust me, and he said, well, present it in the cabinet. And prior to presentation in the cabinet, while the word got out that we were doing something very dramatic, even the honorable judges, who were certainly very concerned about the state of affairs in the country at that time, asked for a presentation, and I gave them a presentation. And I gave presentations to a number of different stakeholders, clearly because they were very worried about how something so new and novel was going to be executed at that scale. Finally, I took it to the cabinet, and of course, this is no secret that there was massive opposition. There was massive opposition from the traditional politicians who saw there was no justification for money to be handed out in any other way than the traditional way, which was for money to be handed out to them and for them to go to their constituencies. And to
but it's even more sinister than that. And again, not to do necessarily just with that cabinet. I think this is a Pakistani elite problem, which is that we're much more used to giving money to the super rich as subsidies and, sort of sweetheart deals to continue providing whatever quantum of jobs they claim to provide. Meanwhile,
but Mosharraf, the contention was not, the disagreement was not giving it to the poor. Okay. They wanted discretion.
Okay.
Yeah. Some MNAs and MPs wanted discretion. They said in previous disasters, we used to have money, we used to go to the constituencies, give it to people who had who had their allegiance to us. And I was trying to explain to them, here is something that we could execute at scale. It's data-driven, it is totally digitized, it will remove discretion. Even I will not have a rupee's worth of discretion, but it is something scalable. And there were fireworks in the cabinet. And of course, the press carried stories the other day which were true, except that I did not cry, which was reported.
Yeah.
And finally, the Prime Minister.
I think that's just inherent misogyny that would drive.
Yes, they assumed that a woman minister would cry. But
and to be fair, if ministers would cry, I can name a few male ministers that I know would cry more readily. Who would do
a better job.
Yes. So.
The Prime
By the way,
Minister,
I'm also a male crier, so it's not as a pejorative that I say that.
So the Prime Minister weighed in. The plan was approved. I was given the money, and I and my team members, we worked round the clock. I remember there was a time when there was nobody in the Park Secretariat because everybody was working remotely. And my family was deeply upset with me. She said, you are exposing yourself by being outside, by being in the field. And there are times when you have to do that, when there are things above your own self and your own safety. So we executed. So the first thing we did was made mass announcements. Please send your ID card numbers on an SMS. So when we made the announcement, over 100 million SMSs came in over a course of a few days. And
I think less than 3 weeks.
Yes, yes. And when they came in, they had to be processed. We had to run them through data analytics. We had to do that in batches. There were rules that applied.
And you matched that data against people's cell phone usage,
yes,
their international travel.
There was a criteria
their
that
FDR.
was used. Yes. And that criteria was approved by the cabinet, and we were very transparent about it. And we were transparent about the limitations of that as well. And we triangulated information with the existing survey. So there were batches that were coming from the survey. There were batches that were coming from outside. And then they were getting processed. We would run data analytics and then send batches to the banks. And then the banks would send SMS notifications asking them to queue up and come on specific dates. Now, this seems very simple when I explain it, but it was very complex to execute the first time.
Especially with a kind of 19th century core government infrastructure.
Yes, and with all kinds of audit concerns looming, with all kinds of procedural issues looming. And I told my colleagues, I said, we have to execute it for the good of the people. We cannot, and we'll deal with audit and everything subsequently. So it was all rule-based, it was all digitized, data-driven. There was a data trail of everything. And then the first thing I did was to make dashboards. And everybody told me, what on earth are you doing this? I said, no, there's going to be dashboards showing where the money is going, to which decile is money going, and we have to disaggregate it by province. And I remember the first day when the dashboard went up, a very well-known journalist tweeted and said, कि जी ये तो पाकिस्तान की हिस्ट्री का बहुत बड़ा फ्रॉड है, क्योंकि इसमें महमूद खान की उसमें तहसील में जा रहा है and वज़ीरिस्तान में नहीं जा रहा. So then very politely I responded and said that, this batch is getting money based on the survey results, which was 10 years old. And at that time, because of the insurgency, there was no survey done. And that's why for the next 1 week, Waziristan will have no money. And when we switched to incoming requests, so after that, there was no complaint. But from day one, I would appear on radio and television every day and explain what we were doing.
I remember. One issue that critics, including myself, had with the execution was, I think it's like the old workplace adage that if you work hard and you're the high performer, all of the expectations get dumped on you as well. So in your case, Dr. Saab, I think one issue was that given how robust the mechanism was and how quickly it came together, again, I think people forget COVID hits in late Feb in terms of the reality of what it was going to be. Within a month and a half, essentially, this was up and running.
We were up
By the end of May, you had already dispersed half the money, which I think is just unbelievable. Really.
And in fact, in the World Bank assessment, after 1 week, we were the fastest disbursers.
Gee, and as a Pakistani, of course, I felt great pride. I thought that this was a great achievement for Pakistani institution building. Of course, it was a credit to you, but in many ways, it was a credit to the people that founded BISP. It was a credit to the sitting government, credit to previous governments, credit to the overall system, credit to the banks. But on the banks, the critique part was that given how quickly and how digitized everything was, the one step of the journey that wasn't as digital was that people had to line up at the banks. And, we saw some unfortunate imagery that came out of that. And my argument at the time was that, with Telenor, Easy Pesa, and with Jazz Cash, and with all these instruments, did we miss a trick? Did we miss an opportunity? I know there's a good reason why that wasn't possible, but maybe...
Yes, so in the book I explain the opportunity that was there and the reason why we were unable to tap it. So when the decision was taken that we were going to be disbursing money at this scale, the telecom operators came and offered that they would open their their pipeline for us, but for us to put money into digital wallets. Now, we could not do that for two reasons. Number one, the familiarity to use that at a street level. People would have had money in their digital wallets, but unable to actualize that. So you see, I realized that there were throngs of people, and I realized, but people actually got cash in their hands, which they could immediately utilize. And by putting money in wallets, the country was not ready for that. A few years down the line, when there's appropriate financial literacy, when there's appropriate use of that particular tool, it would be a good idea when Khuda na Khasta the next disaster hits. That was not the time. And to me particularly, the ease of people, the ease of getting money into their hands was of prime consideration, number one. Now, assuming even if that financial literacy consideration was not there, I still would not have been able to use it. Why? Because we were already under contract with 2 banks.
Al-Falah and Habib.
Yes, and we had run through procurement process.
It was a totally legit.
And we had spent several months integrating with them.
Okay.
So for me to make the case for a sole source contracting, because that is what it would have been, for me to make a case for sole source contracting of other vendors, abandoning the vendors that I had, would not be justifiable. And to contract them again would have taken 6 months, and it would have been a huge scandal. We wanted to give cash. We had vendors that could disburse cash. It was imperfect. It led to a lot of throngs. But even today, Mosharraf, when I go to a shop, inevitably some waiter will come up to me or some shopkeeper will come up to me कि बहुत शुक्रिया, हमें जो 12,000 मिले थे, बड़ा मुश्किल वक्त था. It was a very difficult time for us.
Yeah.
And those 12,000 were transformative for us. And I think the trick was, in large-scale execution, you have to take calculated risks. And if you follow process, if your hands are clean, and if you're willing to communicate effectively, because that's what we did. Every day I would come. I remember the first day I came on radio hookup, and radio graciously provided me with hookup every day. The first woman called and said कि मैंने text किया है, मुझे message आया है कि I've texted and messages that my father's to collect this money, but my father's died.
Yeah.
So I explained to that girl. I said, "Is your father's death registered?" She said, "No." So I said, "Our system has no way of knowing your father's died. Our system has hopped circles and found your father as the eligible person." And then I used that hour to explain to people how that system works in case there is a death in the family and what they do. That same afternoon, I went to a place where all these daily wage workers congregate. And I stood right in the middle and I said, "How many of you have heard about Ikasi Qatar 8171? Everybody raised their hands. I said, "How many of you have texted?" Half of them raised their hands. So I was very curious. I said, "Why is that the case?" And one of them, who knew I could speak Pashto, came up and said, "Because I don't know how to text. I know only how to receive a phone and make a." And I felt so humbled standing there that, we make these assumptions that people know how to text. So then I immediately went to the TV station. We called for volunteers to come in. And at the same convening, another laborer said, "We've heard about 8171, but I don't have balance.
So
I don't have balance."
Free. Yeah.
So then I ran and made it free.
Toll free, yeah.
And then I remember in the first week, the retailers got after me and said, "You are making us work in this difficult environment, and you are cutting a 40% tax. There's a combination of federal and provincial tax. You have to do something about it." So I went to to ECC with a proposal, and I was told off. It says, "We're in an IMF program. Don't ask for a tax waiver." So the next morning, I was going with the Prime Minister in a helicopter, showing him a site, and I explained the issue to him. I said, "Look, I've got to keep these people incentivized to deliver, and I'm not getting a waiver from ECC." So then he weighed in, and we got the federal tax waiver. I spoke to every chief minister, got the provincial part waived off. I'm just trying to explain that it was it was flesh and blood. It was a living program.
No, and I
It
really
was
appreciate the detail
really-
because I don't think people understand what goes into public policy, especially if it's bold and it's trying to do something different. I almost feel like it's my job to then challenge that further and suss out what further opportunities. But I think I'll wait for the book for the second round of, because I think, financial inclusion is a massive challenge, as you already know, and I know you've worked on this. To my mind, maybe that opportunity was to drive, because clearly with the SMS campaign, my sense is you probably drove a formalization of a substantial number of Pakistanis, probably in the millions, people who would not have engaged with the system in a documented, formal way until this opportunity presented itself. So I just wonder what the net knock-on impact of going through digital wallets might have been for the financial future of the country. But let's litigate this in a second conversation.
But let me quickly respond to that.
Okay.
Because I think that contactless payments, payments through wallets, and all these second generation digital payment options are the future, especially now that we have RAST as the backbone.
Absolutely.
Now that we have an interoperable system. And I think that we could do something very disruptive to institutionalize it. And there always is an opportunity, and we must. All I'm saying is that back in 2020, when the country was at the verge of a humanitarian disaster, I did not want to risk throwing...
I think that's fair, yeah.
Throwing money into wallets.
I accept that, yeah.
Risking a scandal for, administratively.
Given all the other risks you were already taking. Yeah.
But but till the last day when I was in office as a minister in, I think it was 8th of April 2022, I was in consultation with the State Bank, the infrastructure that was designed, I pushed it further. I left, I think, a 20-page letter that was my last communication to my secretary, explaining the steps that had been taken with the central bank and what needed to be followed up to leverage RAST as a mechanism of mainstreaming digital payments within the country.
So let's talk about this intragovernmental, intradepartmental kind of challenge that I think people, again, don't quite appreciate the complexity of what it takes to get something done. I think in government everywhere. So this is, again, not unique to Pakistan, but I think with 250 million people, with the kind of poverty we suffer from, with the kind of very specific climate and security challenges we face, it's more urgent for us than it might be for other countries. So you, in a federal role, I think you had 2 or 3 really interesting challenges from a governance perspective. The first, of course, was that you were heading a brand new division, a division that, was started really, was essentially your brainchild. It was a consolidation in my mind, or to my understanding, of years of thinking through the challenges of poverty alleviation. Talk a little bit about how that came together, but more importantly, the challenge then that you faced on 2 fronts. One was horizontal, that you had to sit in cabinet and basically create ownership amongst especially finance division, but also other divisions, to be not just respectful, but almost to be champions for what you were trying to do. But then the more complex challenge, I think, is from a federalism perspective, is how the poverty alleviation division and the role that you had in that function related to provinces, and the fact that maybe you didn't have a plug-and-play mechanism with each of the provinces. Whether or not related to COVID, how does all this sort of play out for you?
So I think the different strands of what you've talked about. But let me outline as a starting point that delivery in a public sector context, delivery at scale, does not have the labels of ministries on them. You need to work cross-sectorally. So take any dimension of Ehsaas, if it's the COVID emergency cash, or whether it was Ehsaas Ration Riayat. I think that's a perfect example of that. We worked with finance because because there were co-payments from the provinces. So finance had to make sure that from their national finance account disbursements, there was money deducted, and I needed the support of the finance minister for that. We needed the provinces involved. The entire district machinery of the province implementing provinces had to be mobilized for Ehsaas Ration Riat. I used to have a phone call with chief ministers, with all the district DCs on the screen every week for every implementing province. So the province was mobilized, the district was mobilized, and of course the DCs.
So that's in the Punjab, that's 37 DCs plus,
yes,
plus
yes.
Lahore, the chief minister,
Absolutely.
and the ACS. Yeah.
Absolutely. The National Bank of Pakistan was involved, the Punjab Bank was involved, PTA was involved, and of course my own machinery was involved. So what I'm trying to communicate is that when you develop a delivery engine, and here you are a Minister of Social Protection, but I spent more time speaking to Chairman PTA and to President National Bank. I spent more time with chief secretaries of the 3 provinces that were implementing, and saw more of the DCs than I saw my own staff. So we think government is one entity. Government is not one entity. Government is an archipelago of many different entities which have a disincentive to collaborate. They really have a disincentive to collaborate.
Should they have that disincentive?
No, no. Yeah. Because in all my large-scale execution engines, I brought together the different competencies and institutions to execute. And of course, there were institutions at the regulators at the federal level. There were banks that reported to the central bank. There were provinces, and there were districts, and of course the federal entities that were under the rubric of the cabinet. So to deliver, we need to think very differently.
So almost as a kind of, this is one of those unguided missile questions, but it's a thought that I have, and I've always gone with my instinct. If somebody asked me what, nobody's asking, but if somebody was to ask, Sania Nishtar is in Islamabad and she's got all this experience. What's the ideal role for Sania Nishtar? My argument or my advocacy, quite strong advocacy, would not be for you to go back into public health or social protection. Or I think that I would advise people to consider you as an architect for public sector reform, because anything that the public sector is going to deliver, whether it's climate resilient infrastructure, whether it's roads and highways that work for the people, whether it's better irrigation, whether it's small business loans, it doesn't matter what the vertical is, the unintegrated and disjointed nature of a 19th century public sector architecture is really the principal challenge. It doesn't matter whether the Prime Minister is person A or person B. It doesn't matter how excited we become about Agenda A or Agenda B. At the end of the day, all governments, no matter what modality they're under, are going to essentially fail. And I think you've lived through that and been able to put together an exceptional non-failure in terms of the work that you did.
So it's gracious of you. Because since a very early phase of my career, I learned how to build things, build my own institution, take it to some scale. So I'm good at delivery. I'm good at piecing things together, and of course, wherever I am, whether I'm outside of the country or here, and I'm tasked to do large-scale delivery, I'd like to believe I'm good at that because of the privilege I've had of being in positions where I've honed that ability. But public sector reform is over and above that. I mean, if you are talking about durable public sector reform, then you have to look at some distortions within the system. Because whenever we do a sectoral deep dive, and all of us do that, you go into the health sector, you go into petroleum, you go into power, you go into sugar, you go into wheat, you come up with a set of problems. Recently, I did these 2 pieces on prices of electricity and why we have high prices of electricity. The issue boils down to governance. I did another piece for, the distortions in the wheat cycle, and all roads lead to Rome and you come to governance. The problem is that we've got some foundational, some fundamental problems. And unless those fundamental problems are addressed, you can bring a Nobel laureate and ask them to do a macroeconomic policy. It is not going to work. And those fundamental distortions are A, the absolute lack of accountability for decision making. Whether there's a minister or a secretary, he's just not accountable for any decision he or she takes, or any decision that he or she does not take. We have constructed laws and norms and policies with loopholes. We completely abhor anything that has to do with conflict of interest, and you can recall the recent ruckus that you witnessed in the Senate when I just talked about changing the conflict of interest rules and disclosing where we get remunerated from. And then there's no policy consistency, no accountability for how you've detracked from course, how you've detracked from evidence. So you tell me you have a system where there's utter and sheer lack of a decision maker's accountability and answerability, number one. And number two, you have constructed and created laws and norms and policies with loopholes that you will systematically exploit. And number three, you're going to promote, you have a culture where you promote bureaucracy with political leanings.
Yeah. But also even if they don't have, the qualification seems to me, if you've spent so many years, you get to occupy this office. And it seems to me in the 21st century that this is a poor way.
We have such good secretaries in the system.
Sure.
We have such good secretaries in the system. We have good additional secretaries. We have good joint secretaries. All we have to do is to pick people with clean hands.
So this wasn't originally, but since you've talked about it, I think it's important to maybe just, and I'm also conscious of time, I've benefited from so much of your time already. What would you say to people who say, look, this accountability function has always been essentially misused, and so we've created a false norm. So I think a great example is Dr. Ismail Shah. He just was last week essentially cleared of charges for charges that never should have even seen the light of day. But for 6 years, this man was single-handedly responsible for taking Pakistan's telco sector from the Stone Age to the digital age. I think there's no 3G spectrum auction if he does. And the reward he got for taking that decision was accountability. He had a NAB case against him, and he suffered for 6.5 years in a case that everyone, top to bottom in Pakistan, knew was false and motivated.
So you see, one of the greatest disservices that NAB has done in this country is to stigmatize the word accountability. Because accountability in this country is always seen as being synonymous with political exploitation. Accountability in the governance parlance is anything but. It's about answerability. You have a beautiful office. What will you do to this cameraman if he goes and throws your sofas out and crashes your windows and puts paint all? Are you not going to reprimand him? Is there no consequence for him?
He would never do that. But I see the point you're making.
Imagine that he did.
Yeah.
If
there have to be consequences.
If there were officer A and B were hugely disruptive to your work environment, would there be no consequences for that vis-a-vis a person who's the top performer? But the incentive structures are so misaligned.
Yeah.
You reward political allegiance. There is no respect for merit. There is no answerability for the decisions you've taken or you have not taken. And as a system, there's total lack of policy continuity for good. So with these kind of distortions, you can conceptualize and conceive sectoral reform in any area that you want.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work.
You're right, and I think that we've struggled. We were talking about this off camera as well with optimism for our people and for this country. Me, frankly, and I'm sure this is shared, even for the region. I mean, you look at the state of women in Afghanistan, young girls not being able to go to school. You look at the way in which extremism has totally overtaken society and state in our very important, very large country next door in India. And it doesn't leave a lot of hope. But one area of hope that I feel is going to be the pathway out of all this is the very large quantum of young people that not only Pakistan, but this whole region is blessed with. I mean, I know we've talked about the failures that the system kind of has delivered to trap young people. But I wanted to maybe end the conversation on where you think optimism is well-founded.
Well, I think there are many reasons for optimism. I think Pakistan is a great country. We have not just a great demographic dividend, but we also have a society which is hugely resilient, deeply compassionate. And don't forget, we're a very large market. So if we get our governance right, the whole world would want to come and invest here. But if you look at the evidence very carefully, if you look at the international league tables, Pakistan doesn't rank very badly when it comes to these societal indicators. It fares very badly when it comes to the governance indicators and the corruption-related indicators. And because corruption is basically, and there are various shades and hues of corruption, and it goes on regardless of who comes at a certain level. There are shadow rules which govern the functioning of all institutions. If the person at the top or the minister at the top has clean hands, he or she is not going to take a cut out of that. But otherwise, you go into post, you go into the parastatals, you go into PIA, you go into railways, you go into the BHUs, you go into the schooling system, you go into petroleum, you go into the value chains of sugar or wheat or wherever you go. It's deeply, deeply ingrained. And it is fueled by the arbitrariness, by the lack of conflict of interest safeguards. It's fueled by the lack of accountability within the system.
Do you not feel, Dr. Saiba, that it's also become extremely pervasive and sophisticated? I mean, you mentioned the wheat and sugar, supply chains. I mean, to my mind, corporate, even foreign companies, multinationals, the nexus they have with domestic, essentially price gouging, and that nexus with large-scale farmers and people who benefit from a sweetheart tax regime on, for example, a certain kind of agriculture, the way in which water is being extracted, and now there are solar panel schemes for extracting water with even more abandon than previously. So when you put all this together, the momentum for this nexus of, and I don't like using the word corruption just because I think it's been weaponized and almost bastardized by political populism in a way that actually takes away from our ability to affect it.
You can call it collusion.
Sure, but there is definitely it is a problem.
Collusion, arbitrage, this is a wholesale collusion and arbitrage.
But given how wrapped up the entire system is in it, how do you begin to disentangle and fix this in a way that engages hope and optimism and stops the kind of bleeding of talent that I think we've seen in this country over the last several months?
Yes, I think the bleeding of the talent is very painful because you very rightly talked about the demographic dividend we have and the potential that we have and the opportunity to harness that for growth, for development, for good in general. But I live right across a visa office, and I see the throngs of people there.
Yeah.
And our passport processing, the visas have gone up the roof. So it's very disheartening to see the skilled labor leave the country. But to your question about how to fix this, you have to fix the basics. You cannot have such basic distortions and expect the system to run. Today, the people that profiteer, there's a small coterie of individuals and households and constituents comprising of a variety of different stakeholders that are benefiting from the large scale collusion and arbitrage which is inherent to the system. It's a very small group of people that are profiteering, and I think for someone to fix it, you need to think in terms of black and white. There is no gray here. If you're going to pursue a gray agenda, things are not going to get fixed in this country.
I think on that note of clarity, at least moral clarity, we kind of, I thank you profusely for the time you've taken. I do hope that we'll be involved in the process of your book launch, and we'll have another opportunity after I've read the book to talk to you again, Dr. Sania Nishtar.
We will talk about that offline, and certainly welcome that.
Absolutely. I'd look forward to reading the book. Very grateful that you took the time today, and look forward to re-engaging very soon. Thank you so much.